Sir, we are live now. Please start.
Sure. Yeah, so hello everyone, and thanks for joining in today. So just to reiterate, we will have two sessions today. In the first session, Dr. Suresh Kumar will be talking about bird migration, and in the second one, we will get to interact with Dr. Suhail Kader and Dr. Suresh Kumar right here. So throughout the two sessions, if you have any questions, please do not unmute yourself, but you can enter your questions in the chat box. We will definitely come back to the questions later. So before beginning with the first lecture, I will quickly like to introduce Dr. Kumar. Dr. Suresh Kumar is a scientist at the Wildlife Institute of India, Dehradun. He works on a variety of taxa, including macaques, turtles, salamanders, and of course, birds. He specializes in animal ecology, conservation, migration, and movement studies. He is a part of many different studies tracking the migration of birds, including that of the Amur falcons. I'm sure all of us are very excited to know more about bird migration from him today. So before taking any more time, sir, over to you.
Thank you, Devika, for this opportunity, and I very much look forward to this interaction today. I tell stories, so thanks for that introduction. And I wanted to tell stories about some of my study species, but then I've been told that I need to give a broad, talk about, migration and all a little bit textbookish, I would say. Many of these areas I don't work on, but I generally have a presentation for my own students here at Wildlife Institute. So I have tried to modify that quite a bit with a lot of pictures so that the audience are connected. And I am hoping that definitely some of them will be interested and be influenced by what I'm talking about today. And so, yeah, so moving on with the presentation. Why is this not moving? Okay. So many of you out there in the audience today, I'm sure all of you are interested in birds. That's why I probably signed up for this course. And whether you have signed up for this course or not, I'm sure many of you are avid bird watchers and also had taken interest to watching birds just as a, to spend your time. And many of you must be professional bird watchers too. And many of you are definitely thinking of pursuing this as your career. And birds have definitely shaped your thoughts or have influenced you in some way or the other. So was the case with me. Bird watching started off early on for me, and at a time when I really didn't know anything about migration, but I did see that certain birds suddenly appear and they're not seen for a long time to come. So then reading about it, I realized that these birds are coming from somewhere far and wide. Even if you go to some of the remotest parts of India and talk to local people, they may not have seen a textbook on bird migration, but they definitely have knowledge that there are birds that come only seasonally or only seen during a certain point of time. Sitting here in Dehradun, with spring slowly setting in, the barn swallows have started to arrive. And images like this gives you the feeling that these birds have come from somewhere and they have come together and they're moving somewhere far. And in one of the places where they breed high up in the mountains here, this particular image, you can see that there is a goddess there. And the arrival of these birds is actually welcomed by the local people. It also symbolizes that, there would be posterity, there would be more, wealth coming into your home if these birds do come into the house to nest. So there's a lot of folklore, there's a lot of knowledge about birds coming, but what we don't really know is about where they're coming from, what are the different strategies that they adopt. So today's presentation, touching upon all of these, I'm going to be talking about those things in detail. And again, images like this gives you a feel of some birds coming from somewhere in the from far distant countries. These are the bar-tailed godwits along the Gujarat coastline. They're not there through the year. They're there only for a certain period of time and then they are gone. Then the pied cuckoo has a lot of mention in the Indian folklore. Again, in the northern India, people look out for these birds. So their arrival symbolizes arrival of the monsoon. And so again, all of these tells us that these birds are gone in a certain time of the year. They are gone somewhere very far, and they only return during a certain time of the year. So having said all this, across the world, birds, because of their ability to fly or the ability of flight, they have colonized almost every part of the globe, every continent, including Antarctic, even the Arctic, all the polar caps, deserts, and in incredible landscapes everywhere. So what we know today is that nearly 40% of the world's total bird species migrate. There may be long distance migrants, there may be short distance migrants. Some of these long distance migrants are trans-hemispheric migrants, moving from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, or moving from the southern hemisphere, crossing over into the northern hemisphere. And some of these migrants also take different routes on their migratory journeys. So what we call generally understand as elliptical migrants. They go down south in a particular route and return back in another route. So what shapes all these migrations, and why some of these birds are making such long distance migrations, which is quite expensive in terms of the energy and putting themselves to a lot of risk, but they still do it. That's how they've been shaped. So that's the fascinating aspects of bird migration. So very often when we talk about bird migration, we talk about the some of these very interesting species which are known for their unique ability to fly long distance for non-stop for long periods of time. Some of the examples here are the bar-tailed godwits, Amur falcons, sharp-tailed sandpipers, the bar-headed geese known for crossing the high Himalayas. So incredible number of species, and these are all record holders of sorts. So to start off with, let's talk about the bar-tailed godwit. This is the current record holder for making these non-stop flights of over 9 days and crossing almost 12,000 kilometers over the Pacific Ocean. And on the return migration, they return back via the Asian, along Australia and Southeast Asia, and then back to the breeding grounds. I was talking about the elliptical migration that some birds do. This is one example of an elliptical migrant. Shorebirds like these do associate themselves with water, but undertaking these oceanic crossings like this is an extremely risky affair. Why would these birds make these non-stop flights over the middle of the Pacific Ocean? Why wouldn't they do a flight along this particular route where they can actually make several stopovers? That they don't do it. So there are certain strategies that these birds adopt, and we will talk about that a bit later. I had also mentioned about the bar-headed geese, known for their epic high mountain pass crossings. The high Himalayas holds the record for probably flying the highest, on migration to their breeding grounds in Mongolia. A lot of studies have clearly documented this and clearly show that the bar-headed goose have special adaptations, high hemoglobin content, especially which is required when they're crossing these high mountain passes where the air is very thin, there is not much oxygen. So they have adapted for this, so they could simply cross over. Many other species would definitely avoid these Himalayan ranges and would take a circuitous route to fly into the Indian subcontinent. So the Himalayas have actually shaped a lot of migratory species, the way they come into the country or the routes that they take to come into the country. So moving ahead, the Amur falcon, a lot of you have heard about the Amur falcon, but we did not know much about it till recently, till about a few years ago. So thankfully, with tracking studies, we have very detailed insights about this particular species and what it is able to do. This is another example of a trans-hemispheric migrant going down all the way from northern China, going down to southern Africa. So literally this particular landscape is known as the Manchurian steppe, and Manchurian steppe to almost the grasslands there in southern Africa known as the African velds. So on their way down south, they take a particular route, but on the way up, especially while cutting across the Indian subcontinent, the routes are different. So this is again an example of elliptical migrant. And it again here to show you that this is a species that definitely avoids the high Himalayas, or else it could have just cut across like this. That's what we would think. Now, there are many other interesting facets about these birds, which is that on the way down south, they would stop here in Northeast India and go down to Southern Africa. But on the way back, they wouldn't stop in Northeast India, but continue on their migration across into Southeast Asia and head back to their breeding grounds. So lots of questions as to why these birds are doing that. Okay, so moving ahead, again, images like this just simply catches your imagination. Incredible number of birds. All of these things dictate to you that these birds are on migration, and also that these birds, also that the Amur falcons passing through India are known as passage migrants. Okay, many birds stop over in India, which is their wintering destination, and return back, because I told you this is a transhemispheric migrant. It passes through India. So this is one of those examples of a passage migrant cutting through India. And images like this or visuals like this that you get to see is only for a short duration of time, maybe about a month or so, or 15 to 20 days or so. And thereafter they are gone, and only are seen the next autumn when they're again passing through India in such numbers. But all that we know now is that all of the world's Amur falcons pass through Northeast India, which until recently we did not know about. Now, here is another example I would like to share with you when we talk about migration, is this particular species, which is Blythe's warbler. You can see that the entire world population of the Blythe's warbler comes into India and then migrates back to the Palearctic region or the European region where they belong during the breeding season. So these birds do not belong to any one country. They move across landscapes and require, in fact, the whole of the entire range for them to survive. So having talked about these examples, coming to the issue of migration, why do these birds migrate? Okay, so what is migration? Prolonged movements from one place to another taking place periodically, and it involves regular outward and return movements. So almost on a annual basis, you would see these birds arrive at a particular region and then disappear and then come back again during that period of time. So this is a very regular outward and return movement that you will notice. Migrations are associated with specific seasons, okay, and tied to their reproduction and endocrine system. And it's also seen in those species that face the problem of occupying a habitat suitable only for a portion of the year. The remaining time of the year, those areas are not hospitable for them, and they would have to move out in order to survive. The only notable example that I could see or read about is about this particular species known as the common poorwill, which is a species of nightjar that has been discovered hibernating in the deserts in California, surviving long cold spells in a torpid condition. So this could be one of the few examples of birds that can have the ability to hibernate, or else most of the birds would move to different landscapes or go on their migration. So migration is distinct from dispersal. So the movements that we look at, a dispersal movement is very different. It is not migration, in that migratory animals typically move from one geographic region to another without using the intervening habitat. So there could be a few places where they could stop over, but it's only for a short duration of time and then move on. So when you look at the patterns in bird migration, you would see quite a varied types of patterns. The migratory birds are mainly northern species. The simple reason being most of the land on Earth is concentrated in the northern hemisphere. And because of this, the majority of migratory bird species travel north to breed and return south for the winter. Migratory birds follow different migratory routes. So it could be north-south migration, east-west migration, or it could be altitudinal migration coming down from high up in the Himalayas down to the foothills and go back. And then seabird migration could slightly be different because they follow ocean currents or jet streams, which actually dictates where they go or where they spend the time in their year. So within a single species, some populations may not move at all. Now, some may move only a short distance and others may migrate far. So you do see quite a bit of variations within a population in terms of their migratory movements or journeys. Birds may be seen migrating almost anywhere, but geographic features and food availability tend to funnel them along general routes called flyways. Now, if you look up, if you think about those visuals that I had showed you earlier about the Amur falcon's flight path or the bar-tailed godwit, these are all actually being dictated by food availability and also certain weather conditions and things like that. So generally, mountain ranges, large bodies of water, river systems, ocean coastlines, and deserts create obstacles, or they are like barriers for for them to move from one place to another. But some of these birds also have have actually taken advantage of these ecological barriers. So what we think as ecological barriers are in fact actually helping them or facilitating their movements. For an Amur falcon cutting across the Arabian Sea, a 3-day long 3,000-kilometer flight is a major obstacle. But however, they still do it because the Arabian Sea at that particular point of time during their migration actually facilitates their migration. So a terrestrial species is taking advantage of what generally appears to be an obstacle or a barrier. So having said all this, when you generally look at birds in terms of the heights at which they fly, so there's quite a bit of variability in terms of at what heights they fly, and there is still very little understanding about a majority of species during migration at what altitudes to fly. This is from adapted from a textbook. You can see that smaller birds like swifts and swallows are generally flying between 2,000 feet at that height. They're taking advantage of low winds over the ground, surface winds. Then at 5,000, 10,000, you see there is a change in species, and you have the bar-headed goose that's flying really, really high up. There are also records of other birds that are flying very high, like for example, the Ruppel's vulture, which has been recorded much higher, but that's not during migration, but generally soaring at in thermals very, very high up. But the bar-headed goose definitely holds the record for cutting across the Great Himalayas. Now, you also see patterns in terms of their migration journeys and their wintering destinations. Like for example, here the Arctic tern, which breeds in the Arctic grounds or in the Arctic region, goes all the way down to the Antarctic region, which is the non-breeding grounds. And this is a record holder of sort because their annual migratory journeys would be about 70,000 plus or about more than 70,000 kilometers annual two-way journeys. So this is a record of sorts, and you can see here they basically use all these ocean basins. And one of the advantages with this bird is that it could land anywhere in water and could fly across. So that's one of the reasons why they're making these long flights. Then you have the common crane here, as the name suggests, common crane or the Eurasian crane, widely distributed in the northern latitudes. But it's the same species, but there are different populations migrating to different parts of the world. And this would mean that they're all taking different migratory journeys. Some of these populations may also meet one another, but they would move to their wintering grounds, which are defined. And in the wintering grounds, they could all will gather together. For example, the common crane or the other closer species known as the demoiselle crane winter in Gujarat. You see all of the populations wintering in a very small area. But when it is time for them to migrate, they generally head in a particular direction, but then disperse off in the northern breeding areas. Here is an example of a species that is the sooty shearwater that breeds in the southern hemisphere, primarily along the coast of Australia and New Zealand and along the Argentina. And they migrate along with the jet streams or the ocean currents spending time in those currents, foraging, and then return down to the southern hemisphere to breed. That is primarily during November to May. So spend much of the time gliding around the ocean waves. So in many species of birds, we also see different age and sexes tend to migrate at somewhat different times. So this is generally known as differential migration. Okay, there is very little understanding why they would do that, but there are a few hypotheses. One of the first hypothesis, the body size hypothesis. Smaller individuals migrate greater distances, inability to survive harsh northern winters. The dominance hypothesis, subordinate birds migrate greater distances due to competition with socially dominant birds. The early arrival hypothesis states that sexual selection may be at play here, influencing some of the territorial sex to arrive earlier and as a result have shorter migration period. In spring, the males of many species of songbirds precede the females, presumably because it is to a male's advantage to arrive in its breeding area early and stake out its territory before its rivals do. In many shorebirds, for example, the parents abandon their precocial young on their breeding grounds and head south in mid to late summer. The young follows weeks or months later. So they have this instinctive knowledge of where they need to migrate. So there are these very interesting and amazing patterns in bird migrations that we see. Also, I want to inform you at the start right here that very often when you see birds during migration or undertaking migratory flights, you would notice that they are V formation flight. These primarily associated with large bodied birds. And in this image, if you look carefully, you can notice that there is a difference among the individuals. There is this particular individual here, which is a young bird, which usually trails behind. And the individual, which is probably the fittest or the adult bird, flies in the front, which is the leader. And then they do change roles. The position of the leader keeps changing during their flight path. So large birds like cranes definitely follow this V formation flight. There are also other large birds that don't do this, but generally they are different in terms of their flight behavior. They may be, they don't flap, they glide. So these things also influence. But V formation flights, especially in the case of common cranes, are extremely beneficial to them. This is simply because of the wingtip vortex, wherein because of the leader bird flapping or putting more amount of effort, the air keeps getting displaced. The updraft and the downdraft helps or supports the birds that is trailing behind to be able to fly much more comfortably than the one in the front. So the leader's position is constantly being changed amongst these birds when they are flying, and it indicates that they are on their migratory flight. Of course, in the case of the common cranes, even in the non-breeding grounds or in the wintering grounds, wherever they forage and return to roost, they return collectively, and even during that time, they would adopt a V formation flight. This is important for large birds like this to sustain long flights during their migration. Now, having given you an idea of all these patterns that we see, now the question still remains, why do birds migrate? Okay, so moving on to that, let's look into this. So generally resources on Earth fluctuate. You may ask why. Okay, so warm summer months may be followed by inhospitable cold. Okay, why? Plants or other food resources may be abundant, but only for a short period of time. Okay, again, the question why? So the best place to give birth or hatch young may not be a good place to find food. In certain species of birds, this is in fact a challenge, but this is more applicable to other taxa groups like turtles and marine mammals and other species. Okay. Now, the main reason for this is because of the seasons. And the seasons that we see in Earth is because of the Earth's tilt, and that it moves on its orbit around the sun, producing these different seasons. So if you see this, the Earth is actually tilted on its axis by about 23.5 degrees. And this tilt ensures that, or dictates that the North Pole in certain times of the year there is hardly any sunlight. But the same when when it is southern summer or summer in the southern pole, you would notice that there is more sunlight in the month of December. So what I'm trying to basically tell you here is that during an annual movement of the Earth around the sun, you will notice that the seasons are reversed between the North Pole and the South Pole. So when it is summer in the North Pole or the Northern Hemisphere, it is winter in the Southern Hemisphere. And the reverse, when it is summer in the Southern Hemisphere, it is winter in the Northern Hemisphere. This is in fact what is shaping the seasons, of course, but it is also shaping the amount of light that is available there and about productivity or the food available to birds occupying those areas during a certain period of time, which is how migration is being shaped. This is again better explained through this animation by MoveBank, Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior, where you can see birds migrating to the lower southern hemisphere and returning back to the northern hemisphere. And you can notice that the snow cover is gradually disappears because the summer is setting in the northern latitudes, and that's when most of the birds go there to breed. And then as the winter starts to set in, these birds return back on their migration to the southern hemisphere, to the areas closer to the equator. You can also notice how the birds are getting funneled into this because these are the land connections. So definitely some of the species are avoiding these oceanic crossings, while some others doesn't really matter to them. They're cutting across and going down to their non-breeding destinations. So how did this migration evolve? When did it all start off? So migration began to evolve when individuals that moved from one area to another ultimately produced more young than those that remained in one area. So it was not only the question of their own survival, but it was also the question of able to produce more progeny. Ice ages is said to have played a major role in migration in birds. So when the birds may have been forced to move to better habitats and back. And that's exactly what we continue to see. When I look at flamingos and the common cranes using landscapes in Gujarat, I see some of these patterns which has been ingrained in these birds in terms of the landscape that they're familiar with. For them, it's the landscape. But when you try to connect the dots or look back, visualize what would have been the situation back during the ice ages, the last ice age, you can probably make connections with that. So migratory behavior continues to evolve because of changing environment. There have been quite a few research in recent times wherein they have found that some of the birds are coming earlier in the year, and some of the birds species, especially in Europe, where there are studies that have documented some of the birds have stopped going down on their migration to Africa and remain more to the Mediterranean coast. So changing environment is definitely shaping how birds behave in terms of their migration. So now, having understood that the seasonality and food availability influences birds to move between landscapes, what actually triggers migration and how do they navigate? What are the mechanisms involved in this? We're going to touch upon that. So migratory behavior is triggered by seasonal photoperiodic cues. Cues are integrated in the brain, in the parietal region, which includes secretion of hormones that triggers migratory movements. So photoperiod is nothing but the number of hours in a day, and this varies with latitude with time of year. For example, in the northern latitudes during northern summer, 24 hours sunlight, especially in the Arctic Circle or in the region above, or the day length is really long, 16 hours, 18 hours day length. But at that point of time, in the southern hemisphere, it's complete darkness, or in the equator, it is constant. It's about 10 hours, 11 hours, the day length. Whereas if birds move to the higher latitudes, they're able to forage for a much longer duration, And because there is so much of light available, there is a lot more food available, but this is all during a very short window of time. Shortening days affect the hormonal levels and induce birds to eat more, store more fat, increase muscle mass, and then start to molt. Basically, this is all preparation for the migratory movement. Later, when these physical changes have taken place, the hormones cause restlessness or restless behavior in these birds just prior to departure. This anxious behavior is known as Zugunruhe, a German term, basically restlessness. And this has been very well studied using a very simple device known as the Emlen funnel back in 1966, where they could test with some of these birds to see how they behave or which is the direction that they would like. Even if you feed the birds at this point of time, they're not interested. So you put them in this cage and you look at how they are moving or using the cage, you will notice that they're all heading towards the northern direction. Whereas in autumn, it is in the opposite direction. And when there is no magnetic field, that basically, in a planetarium where you would test it, you would see that they are just jumping around everywhere, where you can basically shift the magnetic compass. You will see that they're moving everywhere. So clearly indicating that, birds are preparing for their migration. So migrating birds use the sun as a celestial compass in certain species and use sunset to calibrate a magnetic compass to set migratory direction. Starlings have been extensively studied and seem to be able to negotiate the proper direction only if they have a view of the clear sky and sun. Cloud cover seems to induce confusion in these birds. Migrating birds also use the stars to check on their bearing. So they probably have a very good knowledge of the constellations up in the sky. And these several experiments carried out in planetariums clearly suggest this. Birds learn the star map as nestlings and use this information to orient their Zugunruhe. During days of cloudy weather, some birds have been found to use other cues such as wind and definitely landmarks. As you may all know, in the case of birds, there are very few birds where there's a good sense of smell. Generally, most birds, the sense of smell is very poor. But some short distance migrants do use an odor map to return to nesting and wintering site. This has been documented, I think, in Sweden. Studies show that young pigeons learn the odors carried by the wind, which reach their home sites. Then there is also the role of magnetic fields. So they have a sense of magnetic map. Birds may rely on an instinctual map, as in the case of shorebirds, the examples that I had cited earlier, where the young individuals leave much later. Only the adults would have left long ago. So there is no adults around to help them or guide them on their paths. So they definitely have an instinctual map of the direction or the sense of direction as to where they need to go. Magnetic disturbances may interrupt these abilities. And in many other birds, they appear to possess a built-in magnetic compass to use on cloudy days. Birds tested in a controlled environment showed that they knew which direction to migrate even without the sun or the stars. So definitely birds have a lot more of the cues in their brain to orient them or to direct them which direction that they need to go. Physiological evidences support two magnetic sensing hypotheses. This has been tested. Magnetite-mediated magnetic sense. It acts as a part of a magnetic map or signpost sense. Okay, it basically gives you a geographic position and the birds orient themselves in that position and head in that direction. Some recent studies have also found that there is a vision-mediated magnetic compass, which is basically nothing but photoreceptor molecules in the eyes, in the bird's eyes, provides them a sense of direction. They are able to sense magnetic field lines. This is what these hypotheses state. So there are putative sensor molecules that have been found which possess the required biophysical properties and which is expressed in the retina of migratory birds. There have been studies on the garden warbler, a species known as Sylvia borin in Europe, where they have found that during migration, or in this particular migratory songbird, at night, you see there is a very high neuronal activity. So these protein molecules, known as the cryptochrome, are basically influencing them in terms of magnetic orientation. So there's very interesting amounts of research, and has throwing a lot of light into how birds are able to actually navigate. A simple dominant mutation is reported enough to trigger the genetics of migration direction. These have also been, this is possibly the reason why some of the populations head to different places, though they may all be in the same area to breed. So moving on to studying bird migration, this is something that is quite exciting and quite interesting. There are many ways that people have been studying bird migration, primarily observational. Increasingly now, with the help of eBird, with citizen science scientists reporting bird sightings, it's become much more easier at a much larger scale. We're able to visualize what the timing of arrival or departure, or also in a general sense, the routes through which many of these birds migrate. So this is fantastic. Then there are passive tracking methods, like simple methods, which these are simple methods, which basically involves mark recapture or sighting. You mark birds and then you recapture them or you resight them. So this is done primarily through bird ringing. A lot of others do use colors, which are temporary in nature, especially during migration. You're able to put some color dye on these birds and then look for resightings on their return migration to that same spot. So these are passive tracking methods. I will tell you what's the difference between it, but let me first tell you about the active tracking methods. So the active tracking methods are methods using technology. And in recent times, advanced technology or space technology has become increasingly used. So this is primarily through tracking birds from space using satellites, or using GPS satellites through the mobile network. So GSM, GPS transmitter, these are systems that has been widely used. Apart from this, there are also other ways to study bird migration, that is using GPS loggers and geolocators. Now, GPS loggers are devices which don't actively transmit, but these are put onto birds, and they will log the location of the bird at a particular point of time as per what you have programmed. And then the bird is let off, and you need to recapture this bird to download all of the data to actually track their routes or their migratory paths. So this is a form of passive as well as an active tracking method, I would say. The geolocators are again increasingly being used, especially to understand small birds, small passerine birds, which cannot have any of the other transmitters that is put onto them. Usually they weigh less than 1 gram. And what the geolocators basically do, it's nothing but a logger that logs the amount of light luminescence in a particular area. We had discussed earlier that across latitudes, the luminance or the lux amount of light in a particular area is variable. So all that the geolocator do is basically measure that and log that data. And it again, you need to recapture this bird to download that data to map its migratory path. Now, all of these methods are fantastic, are useful in one way or the other. But again, it depends on the quality of data that one desires. Okay. For example, if you're just happy in knowing about how birds are distributed across the Indian region at different times of a year, you could use citizen science records. It does fairly give you data. At this point of time, almost all of the barn swallow sightings are up in the northern areas along the Himalayas. And during winter, all of these birds, when they are migrated, they have gone down to the southern Indian landscape or elsewhere. So it does give you these shifts, but it does not tell you about the paths or the routes the clear tracks that you would get to see in an active tracking method. An active tracking method is also on a daily basis, or at an interval of every 4 to 5 hours, you are able to get a location of your bird as to how they are migrating. So in the case of the passive tracking methods, also involves huge amount of effort. You need to capture a very large number of birds. A lot of this is being done, especially for shorebirds, capturing more than 5,000 to 10,000 individuals or populations of shorebirds in a season, ringing them and letting go. And then you get recaptures, somebody else captures them somewhere, or it is resighted elsewhere. You get an idea of where these birds are moving. But here again, with bird rings, it does not tell you the path or the route, that you're only able to join the dots A to B. So it doesn't tell you the clear migratory paths, or when exactly did the bird depart, and other information that you would require to understand their migrations better, like weather conditions, or wind patterns in a particular time when the bird has started on its migration. So information like this is difficult to come by, and that is only possible through active tracking methods. Now, I was talking to you about bird ringing. This is one of the bird flags, which is widely very popular. Most shorebird researchers do this. You put on these rings. It has different number codes, and you're able to recite it, photograph it, and continue to recapture them. But it, like I told you earlier, requires huge amount of effort. We need lots of manpower looking out for these birds. Here again, examples of lesser flamingos. You can notice that there is a color band with some numbers. You would require the observer to take a photograph or note down these numbers to be authentic, to share with you, and you know that, okay, your particular individual marked has moved to this particular site, but it does not tell you the routes or how long or when did it arrive here, and things like that. So we talked about the active tracking method, the space-based tracking system. You have the eye up in space, which is watching what's going on down here. And so these units, the transmitters deployed on your subjects like birds, and which is actually being tracked by the satellites. And the satellites send out this data to the ground stations. And this ground station, the data is sent to the user, to the individual. So there can be many different satellites from which the data is picked up. And there are satellites dedicated for wildlife tracking. There are satellites which carry a certain antenna. In one of our Indian satellites carries an antenna of the Argos tracking system, though it's not specifically meant for wildlife tracking, but because it carries this tracking, this transponder, it's able to detect movement of birds in this landscape. So there are two major systems. There are a few others which are currently being used. The Argos tracking system is basically through polar orbiting satellites, and these move between the poles. And these are placed at an altitude of about 850 kilometers. And so they have a scan radius of about 5,000 kilometers. And at this, and as these satellites move, they're able to detect any of these tagged individuals which are transmitting, and these signals are picked up by the satellites and is delivered to the ground station. The latest advancement in tracking wildlife, or birds for that matter, is what is known as the Icarus system, which has been developed by the Max Planck Institute for Animal Behavior. And this tracking system is actually placed on the International Space Station, and wherein you can operate, you can actually communicate with the transmitters two-way. In the previous case, the transmitter is deployed and you are not able to reprogram or recommunicate. But with this new technology, you can actually communicate with the transmitter. The International Space Station is about 400 kilometers up there, and has a much larger detection range and a lot more benefits. And so in the near future, definitely a lot of birds are going to be, we're going to get some very interesting insights into these birds. Now, while we talked about the tracking system, now the transmitters or the transmitting units which are deployed on your subjects or in your birds are also undergoing major advancements. one of the biggest things that is happening in recent times is the miniaturization. You have satellite transmitters that weigh 2 grams, which can be deployed. For example, in the pied cuckoo, there is a 2-gram satellite transmitter, the lowest weighing satellite transmitter available in the world. And these, as a result, you're able to actually track birds which are less than 100 grams in weight, or I would say about 70 grams and above. You're able to track them. Of course, there is still a large number of birds, especially passerines, which are very interesting in terms of the migration. We are still not able to, but it's not in the distant future that we would definitely be able to track them. Now, there is a whole series of other tags that are currently available in the market, which basically differs in terms of the system. Like, for example, the GSM GPS system that I widely use on birds. For example, there is a leg mount type where you put it on the legs of cranes. There is a backpack type that you put on the backs of flamingos and vultures and other birds. Then you have also this particular one. This is a patagial tag or a transmitter, which you put on the wings. This is specifically suggested for use on pelicans, spot-billed pelicans or great white pelicans being widely used. So these units are basically GPS units. They have a GPS system on board, and they are able to store a lot more data, primarily because of their size, and they communicate with the GSM network. So they have an international SIM card within them, and they communicate with the GSM network and download the data regularly. And in these cases, I'm able to track those birds for every 10 minutes. I'm able to get a location. You can even track them every 1 minute. You can even get a location of these birds. So this is definitely improving our understanding of a lot of birds. So this is an example of the common crane that we tagged from Gujarat, which went all the way up to northern Kazakhstan and returned back. Every 10 minutes, all along this migratory route, it was able to log a location. So we could clearly redraw the exact routes that they pass through, the mountain passes that they actually cut across, the stopover sites in the desert where they stop for the night, and also the time at which they started on their migration on a day-to-day basis, and what is the time that they arrive in their breeding grounds. As you will see that as they keep moving up, the time also changes. So the birds adapt gradually, and by the time they arrive here, they are almost acclimatized with the time that of this particular region. So 20 years back, similar tracking efforts were attempted from Gujarat. But given the technology at that point of time, you would just get a location here, and then a location somewhere up here, and a location up here. You would just be able to join these dots. It doesn't exactly tell you how it crossed. Did it avoid the high ranges of the Karakoram or things like that? You wouldn't know. But thankfully, with this technology, our understanding of these birds has become far more detailed. Now, the last of the sections in my talk that I was assigned to talk about is migration in a changing world. What is happening with all of our migratory birds? Thanks to this assessment that was done in 2020, the State of India's Birds report, which actually documented what's happening with all of our Indian birds. And what we clearly see is that the overall status of migratory birds in the Indian subcontinent is showing a steep decline, and across the region. And when you look at water birds, particularly, the steep decline in migratory shorebirds seems to mirror population trends reported elsewhere along their range. Much of the Arctic, where many of these birds breed, are still pristine landscapes and not disturbed, and in fact those habitats are quite intact, but still the populations of these birds decline. And the reason for this is that they spend a lot more time in the breeding ground, in the non-breeding grounds, or in their wintering destinations, and much of the threats to these birds is posed here in the wintering grounds. They are facing massive habitat loss and degradation, reclamation of intertidal habitats, especially mud and sand flats, has been seen in Africa, Southeast Asia, and this is happening in large scale. These changes are happening, and as a result, they're losing their habitat. These are the areas where they get to forage, and loss of these habitats would mean that they don't get to feed enough to manage or to move across these to move to their breeding and non-breeding grounds. So this is definitely something to worry. So in order for these birds to survive or breed in the breeding grounds in the northern latitudes, it is becomes far more important or equally important to protect these birds in their lower latitudes or in their wintering destinations. In many parts of Africa, as well as Southeast Asia, and in some pockets in India, hunting is still a major issue when it comes to many migratory species, shorebirds particularly. Energy infrastructure is again changing or altering landscapes, and this is definitely influencing a lot of migratory raptors that use these energy infrastructure to perch, because they're site predators in areas like semi-arid areas like deserts. The birds sit on these perch on the energy infrastructure as perch and get electrocuted. These are there's again a lot of guidelines that has come up as to how to mitigate this issue, but this is definitely a major challenge. Our shift to non-renewable or renewable energy, like solar panels, solar farms, is also influencing or in the form of loss of habitats, wintering habitats for a lot of birds. Climate change is something that's being spoken about a lot in recent times, definitely is having an influence on a lot of birds. There is a lot of research, especially on shorebirds in the northern latitudes. Climate change is possibly even in shaping their morphology or changing their morphology of certain birds. Like, for example, the red knots. Extensive research being done in the Netherlands is showing that long-term research being done on shorebirds, showing that there is a change in the diet, and also with that, there is change in beak morphology of some of these shorebirds, and which is being influenced by climate change. The other growing major concern is disease outbreak. This is the energy infrastructure issue that I'm talking about. These are something that you get to see the whole of Gujarat and Rajasthan, major problems. So disease outbreak has again been a major challenge, and mass outbreak of disease that you see, mass mortality of birds that you see. In 2019, we were witness to avian botulism, which happened for the first time. More than 18,000 birds that died at Sambar Lake. And this is supposedly triggered by changing climatic conditions that has resulted in this mass die-off. So in all of this, we definitely seem to, there is evidence that there is anthropogenic influences on the disease outbreak, and there is still doubts about how bird flu is spread. Is it from wild to domestic or from poultry to the wild birds? It's possible either way. So recently in 2022, there was a disease outbreak in Israel. More than 5,000 common cranes died in that area, again resulting in causing a major concern. So all of this calls for concerted actions. Just some actions alone here in the Indian region is not going to be able to help some of these migratory birds, and it requires across the flyway scale efforts. And the Indian region, falling in the Central Asian flyway, is one of the 9 flyways and includes more than 30 countries. So actions, the concerted actions would require collaborating with all of these 30 range countries. It could be as simple as collating data, collecting information of certain select target birds across this region. So almost 90% of the species that breed in the northern latitudes of Asia migrate to the Indian subcontinent. So the Indian subcontinent or the Indian region is extremely important in terms of being host to many birds during the winter period. So changing land use, loss of habitats is definitely playing a major role in many of these birds. These are the 9 Asian flyways that, flyways across the world that has been identified by Wetlands International. And these are very broad. Of course, there are quite a few birds that occur in one particular flyway, move across into the other flyway. For example, the Amur falcon, it breeds in a region that overlaps with the East Asian Australasian flyway, enters into the Central Asian flyway, and goes all the way down to the West Asian, East African flyway. So recently, in 2018, India launched a national action plan for conservation of migratory birds and their habitats along the Central Asian flyway. So the concerted actions that I talked about, which includes research, monitoring, capacity building, awareness, outreach and awareness, understanding of wildlife diseases, all of these aspects has been factored into this national action plan and needs to be implemented across. It's taking shape, it's taking time, it's slow, but hopefully in coming years, you would see a lot more effort going into understanding our migratory birds. So with that, I end my talk. Thank you very much for listening. I think I jumped about 10 minutes. Sorry about that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suresh, for such an engaging session. And yeah, we have quite a few questions for you, which Tobin, our TA, will probably read out.
Okay. So should I stop sharing the presentation so that?
Yeah, that's fine. Sure.
Okay, stop sharing. Right. Yes, please.
Jobin, are you here? Jobin?
Devika, I can help. Should I do it?
Sure. I just spoke to him actually.
Okay, must have dropped off.
He is going to be here, but
okay.
He is here only actually. He is here, but just Jobin, can you just check your audio? Mic alone. I think your camera is available, but mic alone there's some issue. Can you just check once?
Okay, but let's get started. Suresh, can you hear me? Yeah. So actually, we had some questions. We had a form and some questions actually came in advance of your talk.
Okay.
So they're probably more generally about migration. So
okay.
Maybe you can quickly deal with those, and then we'll come to the ones in the Zoom chat over here.
Sure.
Let's see here. I think some of these have been answered in your talk. How do birds detect the magnetic field? How do birds sense the magnetic field? Is there some specific organ, any particular protein? I think you've dealt with this, in which case we can move on. If you want to add something, then please do.
No, I think I have dealt with it, and I'm not an expert in that, and there are references available. I've cited it, and you will get far more details about it. But primarily, there are certain areas in the brain of some of these migratory birds that help in the whole course of orientation.
Right. And then there's a question from Deepak. Is there any evidence that over the last 100 years, birds have evolved to stop or minimize migration and actually change from being long-distance migrants to more localized migrants or residents?
There are a few examples that I'm aware of. There is a particular species known as the spotted flycatcher, which migrates between Europe to Africa. There is some research which shows that some populations of these birds, not the entire population that has stopped, but some populations of these birds do not migrate. And this information also needs to be undertaken over a long period of time. Okay, so I'm stressing on this simply because in a particular year, the weather conditions can influence how far birds move, or whether they spend a lot more time in the wintering areas and return.
Yeah, thanks. Captain Praveen Chopra asks, is it true that small birds like warblers take a ride on bigger birds like cranes or storks during migration?
Thank you for that question. Something to really think about. I'm trying to visualize. Well, that's definitely not the case. they're definitely not doing that. They have their own ability to make these migrations, and you also need to notice that they have different energy requirements, so which would dictate how they move. So large birds would be able to migrate for a longer distance, making a much longer non-stop flight, whereas small birds would need to stop frequently, so they definitely cannot overlap or ride one another.
Yeah.
Ride above that.
Okay, I'm skipping a couple of things that have already been addressed, but there's one question: with advancements in technology, is there any threat to bird migration due to radio waves, 5G signals, etc., which might be affecting their migration?
Yes, so there has been a lot of thought about it. There's been a lot of discussion on this. There is definitely a community of people who believe that this is in fact happening. But if you actually go in terms of findings from a few research studies, there is no clear evidence to suggest that is definitely happening or that is definitely influencing this. Some species seem to be affected while other species seem to be actually be thriving. So there is no clear connection in terms of these magnetic waves, microwaves influencing birds at this point of time.
Okay. Anuprita asks, how do birds navigate? I think you've answered that. Do they use cues? Okay. Why do bar-headed geese fly at such high altitudes?
Okay. So rather, I would say that they have evolved this ability to fly. The primary reason is that they're able to reach their breeding grounds much faster. If they would have to take a more circuitous route, it would take them all across the Himalayan arc. So if you look at the Himalayan arc, it's almost a 2,500 kilometer axis. And if you look at the adjoining mountain ranges on either end of the Himalayas, it will be another 500 or 1,000 kilometers. So if they are not going to be able to cross across the Himalayas, then they would have to move all around and take a circuitous route. And that would mean spending more energy, more time. So rather, evolve a strategy to be able to climb the Himalayas in one go. And it's basically a 6-hour, 7-hour flight for a bar-headed goose, which migrate from Pong Dam in Himachal Pradesh, which is one of the important staging grounds for bar-headed goose. The day they decide to make a crossing of the Himalayas, they would start very early in the morning, almost like a mountaineer who would like to climb to the summit, something like 2 o'clock in the morning. And by early morning, they're actually able to get across. It is also during this time of the night or early in the morning, there are winds or breeze that is going up, moving up into the mountains or to the higher reaches, which also facilitates these birds. So there are several advantages of actually doing this crossing. Of course, there can always be mistakes and does happen. A few bar-headed geese do end up in some remote high altitude mountain villages where they cannot land and they're doomed to die. So these things do happen, but a majority of these birds do manage to do that. So it's far more advantageous than doing a circuitous route.
Thanks, Suresh. This is a question by Dr. Radhika. Amur falcons have been seen in Lonavala, which is near Pune. Is the Western Peninsula then part of the CAF, which is the Central Asian Flyway, through which the falcons pass?
Yeah, so the Indian subcontinent is under the Central Asian Flyway, and this is a species that is not necessarily part of CAF, but coming from, or you could say, overlapping region between East Asian, Australasian Flyway and cuts across. And Lonavala falls in their flight path. And in recent years, a lot of people have been watching Amur falcons, and it appears that some Amur falcons, in fact, I got to see a few Amur falcon pictures that were shared with me recently from Lonavala. Those were young individuals. So these could be birds that are not fit to do the oceanic crossing, or they were late in reaching the western shoreline or the western board of the Arabian Sea, and do not have the right kind of wind conditions to make the crossing across to Africa. So they got stranded, or they got left behind in Lonavala.
Yeah, and just also to add that I guess these flyways are broad descriptions, but there are many species that don't follow the flyways at all. Like the Amur falcon doesn't follow any particular flyway, or red-breasted flycatcher, and so on. So we shouldn't take those flyways as being representative of all species. That's yeah.
Correct.
Can we have a YouTube recording of today's session? Yes, the YouTube recording is there. It's on the NPTEL Live YouTube channel, and announcement to a link was also sent to you yesterday. The same live YouTube session that you can see live, with some people are seeing live, will remain there as a YouTube recording. Sachin asks, do roads and tall buildings hinder bird migration in India?
Yes, that's definitely the case. This has been found in many parts of the world, especially in America. There's been a lot of reports of birds colliding into these buildings, tall buildings, especially birds that are flying at night. They get disoriented, and in poor weather conditions, they get attracted to light and do crash into these buildings. So there are also practices in many parts of the world to also switch off lights during a certain time of the year when there is a large number of birds flying across. So they do pose a serious problem. And a lot of modern buildings have a lot of glass exterior. It looks fancy, looks nice, and also it's also to harvest a lot more light, and so you reduce your energy consumption. Lighting is less, but these do have impacts on birds. They crash into these glasses or window panes.
Yeah. Nivedita asks, do birds get diverted from their path, and if so, why?
Oh yes, birds definitely, not all birds, but definitely a few individuals or some individuals. These could be just a cyclonic disturbance or wind condition, and they're following winds, and they could just be drifted away. There are often records of birds getting stranded in southern India where they're not supposed to, they don't generally occur. So they're definitely being carried away by winds. That's definitely the case. And this is something that is measurable. There is also a lot of people talking that there is effect of magnetic waves and stuff like that, microwaves and stuff like that. But that may not be true. But definitely, weather is at play in many cases.
There's a question about changing temperatures and changes in other aspects of nature because of humans. Have those brought about a change in migratory patterns? I think you've spoken a bit about that. Maybe a shift in the flyway is being suggested, but there's also timing, I suppose.
Yeah. So I don't think there are. I mean, like again, how Dr. Suhail had earlier mentioned that flyways are broad definitions of how birds are moving in a region, but many of these birds moving from one particular landscape to another. For example, let's take the case of the common crane. Breeds in the northern latitudes, and the populations of these birds come to India. So this population instinctively come to India. Okay, so it's not that temperature or anthropogenic changes. This population decides India is no longer good, or western part of India is no longer good, and that they start migrating to Africa. That is definitely not taking place. So these are different population units. There are different races. There are different subspecies. The bar-tailed godwit example that I gave you is of a population that breeds in Alaska and goes down to New Zealand, which is their wintering destination. The same bar-tailed godwit, there are populations of these birds coming to India. It's not necessary that these populations are coming from Alaska. They are coming from the Russian Arctic, and their migratory routes are very different. So it is not correct, or it's incorrect to say that temperatures and other changes could shift one population of birds from one particular flyway to another. That definitely is not possible in my opinion.
So this is a comment from me, Suresh, but there's some evidence about changing in timing of migration, correct? With changing temperature, birds are migrating at different times of the year.
Sorry, I didn't get you.
There's evidence that birds are changing the timing of their migration. Is that correct? With changing climate change.
Okay, so yes, you're right in that the timing of arrival or the timing of a passage to a particular area, there are definitely a few studies showing that there has been this shift. For example, there is a study here at the Wildlife Institute talking about basically that has looked at Hume's leaf warbler moving up into the alpine regions to breed in the Himalayas. Based on the data that's currently available, it appears that the birds are reaching earlier in their breeding grounds and starting or commencing on their nest building and egg laying. And halfway through, there is a blizzard and they lose the nest. So again, building another nest and investing in another clutch is very expensive for small birds like this. And so, yes, so the timing of arrival, temperature, there is evidence that this is shaping some of these birds, but rather within the region.
Yeah, thanks. Why do some birds like painted and open-bill storks come to India for breeding instead of going towards the north for the sun?
Okay. Okay, so okay, so why they don't go to the north? Okay, so I mean, of course, in this would have been an ideal situation if the painted storks and the Asian open bill move up all the way into Russia to breed, where there is a longer day length. But given their requirements, okay, like for example, both of these birds are water associate species, and they are primarily resident within the Indian subcontinent, and their breeding is shaped by the monsoon. So the area that they range, the area that they utilize, whether it is breeding or nesting or whether foraging, is all influenced by the monsoon, which is predictable within this region here. So these two species, as an example that you've cited, are definitely taking benefit of this. And as a result, they don't really need to go up to the northern latitudes where it's a completely different kind of weather system.
Thanks, Suresh. I was just adjusting my mic. Is it better now? Some disturbance, apparently?
Yes.
Still?
I'm able to hear you.
We are able to. Okay. I'm going to skip some questions which are not about migration, but there's a question about just like the biotic goose has got high hemoglobin level for low oxygen environments. Can you talk about any specific adaptations that bar-tailed godwits have to travel long distances non-stop without food and water?
Okay, so in my presentation, I was basically talking about they need to accumulate fat. Okay, so basically fuel reserves before they start on these epic non-stop flights. And so during the start or at the time of departure, many of the migratory birds, including the bar-tailed godwit, do put on a lot of fat. Okay, but the bar-tailed godwit is able to fly non-stop for 9 days is also because it is able to use only a certain percentage of that fuel load. If you compare this with another migratory species, which is also crossing, say, 5,000 kilometers, but that particular species making several stopovers. So every time they stop, they're putting on fat. Okay, so the amount of fuel that is being utilized in the case of the bar-tailed godwit and in the case of a few other migrants, there is a huge difference. That's what research shows. Okay, so yeah, so this is one of the examples or the strategies by which bar-tailed godwits are able to sustain such long distance flights with that initial fuel load that they have acquired.
Thanks. There's a question about the Coriolis effect and its ramifications in atmospheric circulation. And does this have any effects on bird migration?
Well, there is some research which says that some birds, but again, it's not very conclusive enough to say that it is influencing bird migration. So I would say that at this point of time, our understanding of this is poor.
Thanks, Suresh. Since birds are it says Anupita, birds are very alert to human movements. How are they caught in order to ring them up to put satellite trackers?
Okay, so again, that's a completely different area of work. Okay, a lot of it, there are several different techniques. It's not that one technique suits all, or you can catch any species that you want. So we use mist nets for certain species. We use foot snares for certain other species. We use box traps. So there are quite a few methods by which you can capture. In fact, where birds are associated with humans, they do understand body language very much, so they're quite alert, but you need to outsmart them in trying to catch these birds.
So there's a very interesting question by Anjali, or a comment rather, which I think we should respond to. She says we should not interfere so much with birds, capturing and tagging them in these ways, just to gather our information. It must be very uncomfortable for the birds. We do not have the right. So as scientists, I think conservationists, we need to be able to respond to that. Suresh, so you're in the hot seat.
Okay. See, I don't say that sentiments are not at play. Okay, I would talk only about myself. I'm not doing this research just because I want to know. Rather, much of this information is for our understanding of what is happening with these birds. Okay. Now, if we don't adopt these methods, okay, if we don't tag birds, capture and tag birds, of course, there is an issue of stress. There is an issue of discomfort. But whatever methods that has been adopted, these have been tested enough and clearly indicates that the birds do not actually face this as a major problem. Now, for example, if I have to give you an example of the Amur falcon or the pied cuckoo or any of the other birds wherein we have tagged, there is a thumb rule. If you're putting any device or anything, any instrument that you're going to attach on a bird, it has to be less than 3% of the body weight. Okay, so people have actually done experiments with different weights on birds to see how their natural behavior is being affected. So with less than 3% body weight, birds hardly have any influence. So there is also evidence from the tracking data that we have of the Amur falcon that since the time that one of the individuals that we tagged, we could track it for almost 4 long years. We could track this bird. Now you look at it, so clearly suggesting that their transmitters did not have or did have very, very minimal effect. I wouldn't say did not have effect, but rather I would say very minimal effect, or rather negligible. Now look at it from the other side. Had we not done this, you would not have been able to generate the kind of information that we need to know about this species. Okay. This is again a fantastic species for understanding long-term climate change impacts. So if you look at the pros and cons of it, these kinds of research outweigh what generally one would feel that, oh, you're influencing these birds or you're affecting them. This is what I would say. And of course, as scientists, we are extremely responsible. You might want to pursue a career in research in the future, and wherein it would entail you catching and tagging birds. You need to understand that you need to be very sensitive and conscious about this. Okay, it's not that we just go and put a net and catch a bird and just put an instrument or a tag on it. Yeah. Not able to hear you, Suhail. I think it's switched off.
I muted. There's some noise in my background.
Yes.
No, thank you. And I think if others want to follow up, please do post a comments below, and we'll come back to them, because the ethical concerns are important, and all scientists need to be very aware of them and take them into account. I'm going to skip a few that are not directly about migration, but Revati asks, could climate change or global warming have made the migratory birds' homes in the north warmer, such that they do not any longer need to migrate to the south?
Okay. Most of the birds that go up to breed there, they do move over large areas. Okay, whether they migrate or not, but they do move. The birds that are primarily resident in those areas are ground-dwelling birds, which do not fly very often. And in the northern latitudes, it is the warmer periods of time, or the season is only for a short duration. It is not that with global warming, the entire northern latitude is warmer all through the year or for a much longer duration. No, that's not the case. So what I would say is that birds breeding in those northern latitudes may benefit for a short duration that the during a particular year, the summer was slightly longer. So they could stay on a little longer than usual. But most of these birds have to move out. Now, the question comes as to how far they move out, whether they move all the way down to the equator or move beyond, or whether they remain more closer to the breeding grounds. That's a different story. That is probably being shaped as we speak or as we see.
That's right. I think there's a few species are shortening their migration distance and
Yes.
coming back earlier. That's right. Krishna Priya asks, don't we have the 4 o'clock question and answer session? Yes, this is in fact the 4 o'clock question and answer session, which it consists of both Dr. Suresh answering questions about his talk on migration, and after which I'll be addressing questions about my video for this week on study design. So this is the correct session, I think. Do we know, Krishna Priya asks also, do we know why a bird chooses a particular destination for migration? Because many places have similar climatic conditions. So why is the bird, bar-headed godwit, flying all over the Pacific to New Zealand? I guess she's asking, surely there must be other places like New Zealand which are easier to get to.
How would I answer this? Okay. Now, I told you the bar-tailed godwit, the population that migrates to New Zealand, it's not just the only population, but there are other populations that do that move all the way down to the southern hemisphere, move closer to the equator. There are also these populations. But this particular population, which is occurring along that particular coastline of North America, the Alaskan coastline, they, at some point of time during their during the ice ages, possibly, they were influenced to move down south and found that the areas in New Zealand where they winter or where they spend their non-breeding period is highly productive environment. Also, you need to understand that these birds, these trans-hemispheric migrants, are seeing summer throughout their lives. When they are in summer in the northern latitudes along Alaska, it is summer. And then when it is autumn is setting in, they're moving out. And by the time they arrive in New Zealand, it is southern summer. So the question would be that they are taking advantage of the summer months across their breeding range as well as their non-breeding range. That's how I would be able to tell you what's going on with this population.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? Just to think. And in fact, the same person has followed up asking about Arctic terns. And
Right.
that's exactly the same. Arctic terns live in perpetual summer. But they have to work very hard at it, of course. Yeah. Yeah.
If I may just share a story with you and with the audience relating to the Arctic tern. Can you just give me a minute, please? Just 1 second. Hello? Yes, sir. So they're right now in the printer. They're with the printer. It will take another.
Let me see in the meantime if there are other questions about the ethical aspects. Yeah, I think all the rest of these questions have to be answered by Dr. Suresh rather than myself. So we just have to wait for a minute. I'm going to, I apologize to everybody, but in the interest of time, I'm going to have to skip a couple of questions, maybe some that are more on the physiological side of things. So just focusing on the aspects that Dr. Suresh might be able to throw most light.
Suhail, sorry, just before we move ahead, Sri Balaji needs to change the YouTube link.
Oh, I thought they would have changed at 4 o'clock.
No, they haven't, but I think this is a good time to change it since.
Okay, yes. So we'll wait until he gives the go ahead then.
Yeah,